I want to welcome everybody tonight as we start a new adventure. We're going to start a new Bible study series on the book of Exodus. And this should take us at least a year to go through because there's a lot to unpack in these 40 chapters that we'll find here in this very important book. And so as we approach jumping into the book in the study of Exodus, we're going to do like we always do, and we're going to do an introduction. But probably this book, more than any of the studies that we've done, I really wrestled with what to share in the introduction because there is just so much that we could discuss for weeks on end and hours on end surrounding the importance of this text. And so I've condensed it into what I think will be about an hour of introductory matters that we need to discuss. And then I saved some of them that could be introduced here to be dealt with as we start actually going through the text. Because again, there's a lot of issues with this, as we seen in the video that we watched, Patterns of Evidence, about the Exodus, the timing of the Exodus in relation with Egyptian history and things like that, and what the text itself actually says. Not to mention the other documentary that we've seen, the Moses Controversy. The authorship of the Torah is something that is hotly debated for the last 100 years especially. And so hopefully we can shed some light and bring some clarity to a lot of those debates, because we can in most places. So with that said, we're going to jump into some of the introductory questions that we need to ask before we actually start reading and dissecting the text. And first of all, is the name of the book. The name of the book, for the longest time, going back to its origins, as it was given to the Hebrew people, was actually titled Shemot, which literally means names. And we kind of talked about this in Genesis, because the title of Genesis, Bereshit. And how they titled the books of the Torah is they would take the first word or the first main subject of how the text itself starts. Like we see here in the Hebrew, it says Ve'eli Shemot B'nai Yisrael, and literally translated it says, and these are the names of the sons of Israel. And it goes into the text. And so that's how they determine the name. And so if we were to translate it in English, it would be, the title of the book would be Names. And we're going to see that that is important, because what that is being derived from is everything that we see in Genesis. And so when we approach the book of Exodus, everything needs to be filtered through what we know and what we've learned about what is told in Genesis. Now, here's the thing about it. To the people that Exodus was actually written for and given to govern them for centuries and a millennia plus, they would have been insiders that would have actually known through tradition and the passing down generationally more than what we actually have recorded in the text. Because the text, as we've seen when we went through Genesis, is by no means exhaustive in the stories and the accounts that it gives. And there's supplemental history that's known to the Jewish people that if you actually read that history, it fills in a lot of the blurry lines that are left in some of the places in the book of Genesis, because it doesn't give all the details. They would have been privy to that information, and therefore they would have been insiders, as we are outsiders trying to investigate a book that has its origins almost 3,500 years from this point. And so we're at a disadvantage in some ways. Now, how did the book come to the name Exodus as we know it, right? Because Exodus means departure. Well, when the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into the Septuagint, it was given the name the departure from Egypt, or Yotzei Mitzrayim. And so that carried over into the translation process when it went into Greek, then Latin, and then ultimately into English. And so that is the name that we understand this second book of the Torah as being the departure. That can be a little misleading because the majority of the book is not about the departure, right? There's a lot before and a lot after the departure that needs to be understood. And so that leads us to the next question that we need to ask, and that is, what is the genre? Very, very important question to ask about every book, because what the genre is determines how we are to go about interpreting it. And we've talked about this before in many of our introductions. So what is the genre of Exodus? Well, it's eclectic. Let's just say that. It's a collage of different genres within this one work, okay? For example, it starts out as a historical narrative, right? It's telling us about the history of the people of Israel, where they were when God began to enact his plan to rescue them, to redeem them from the bondage in Egypt. So it has a historical tone in a narrative form, but even more than that, and this is what makes the book of Exodus extremely unique and important for theological matters, is its theological history. What we see in Exodus is the nature and the characteristic of God. How God works with mankind, especially how God works with his covenant people. And I believe wholeheartedly that is through the negligence of the Old Testament, people studying and teaching from the Old Testament, that has led to very dangerous, faulty, and heretical beliefs about the New Testament, as if we're dealing with a different God who has a different nature and different characteristics. And so one thing that's very unique about this book is it starts out historical narrative, it's theological history, and then it has little snippets of poetry here and there, right? The Song of Moses and things like that, the Song of Deliverance that we'll get to in Exodus 15. And then, not only that, it transitions from historical narrative or theological history into law, legal literature. Because this book is what they call a bifid. It is two parts, right? And we see this, let me give you an example of that, what that means. In the New Testament, a writer who writes that way in pretty much all of his letters is the Apostle Paul. He starts out in the early chapters developing theology, establishing doctrine, right believing and right understanding of God and his interaction with man, right? Explaining redemption and what God has done for us and how amazing God is. But then he always transitions into what's called paranesis, which is instruction about moral behavior and how we are to respond to the revelation of what God has done and made available to us. So it goes from, you could see it this way, from deliverance to duty. And the latter half, the entire second half of the book of Exodus, is pretty much law. God establishes a covenant with Israel where he does everything in and through his own power. They do nothing. God brings each of the plagues. Obviously, he uses Moses and Aaron in that process as the people that he has chosen. But he brings the judgment through the plagues on the nation of Israel, which represents the world system, who have the Israelites in slavery and in bondage. They are delivered through those 10 plagues, ultimately with the death of the firstborn. And he leads them out in the wilderness not to be free and autonomous, not to be left to themselves to live it up and do what they want. He freed them from slavery to the world to become slaves unto himself as the creator of the universe, right? So they're not freed in the sense that they're liberated to be autonomous, self-governing, right? No, what does God do immediately? After he delivers them, he gives them guidelines of what they are to do if they are going to rest in the covenant that he has ratified through his own doing in his own power. And that's what we need to understand, and that's why this book is so important. They did nothing to deserve being freed from Egypt. God freed them because he had promised Abraham he would do so. So it was based on promise, and it was all God's doing. Freeing the Israelites was all God's doing, just like salvation for us. The only reason that we can even participate in the plan of salvation is because of everything that Christ has done. However, in response to what he has done, there are obligations, there are guidelines, there are boundaries that we cannot cross if we are going to maintain a covenantal relationship with one another. Just like a marriage. Think about a marriage, right? You have a covenant, but in that covenant, there are vows that are exchanged that one another is to keep for the fidelity or the maintaining of that relationship. And to not abide by those guidelines, those vows, is to put at risk the relationship, right? And that's exactly what we'll find in the book of Exodus. So it goes from deliverance to duty. And that's what the law was all about. When we hear the word law, the first thing that we need to think of is teaching or instruction. Because it's taken from it's the Hebrew word Torah. And the Hebrew word Torah is taken from the root yarah, which means to point or aim at a specific target or goal. And that's what instruction is. And the goal is, we know this, right? Because we have hindsight. We have the whole Bible to reflect on. The goal is what? Eternal life, right? And so that instruction is to guide us to the intended or desired goal that God has for us. Covenant life. And that's what we'll see as we go through it. So it's critical to understand the book of Exodus to have a proper soteriology. Everybody, I've used this word a lot over the last several years, but you do know what soteriology is, right? It's the doctrine of salvation. It is the most important teaching that we have as human beings to understand and grasp. And I have pounded it for the last couple years. And it's still hard for people to grasp because in a Western culture, we've been ingrained in the Jesus paid it all attitude. And it's just a million miles from being biblical or what we see in the Bible. And so the book of Exodus is extremely important because what we see in the book of Exodus as far as theme, and this ties into genre, is it does carry a theme of redemption. It does. But again, we need to understand what redemption means and what it doesn't mean. Because the Israelites that went into the wilderness had the attitude that many Christians do today. They think they're freed to be autonomous. Right? You have types and shadows in the book of Exodus that are transferable and applicable to the New Testament reality. The book of Exodus is full of types, shadows, motifs that carry throughout the entire Bible, even into the New Testament. The New Testament authors draw from these types and shadows, as we'll see in our study in 1 Corinthians in chapter 10. And so there are a lot of things that we can learn and glean if we pay careful attention to what is going on in the book. Some of the things that we'll see as far as themes beyond types, shadows, motifs is we'll see repeated cycles. We'll see a cycle in Moses' life, and I'll point this out as we go through it, that is replayed in the deliverance of the nation of Israel from Egypt. It's amazing. Very amazing. we'll see a lot of creation language or creation reversal language, like in the plagues in the book of Exodus. A lot of the same words are used. They don't jump out to us because sometimes the translators translate it into different English words. But to the people this was given to, it would have jumped out. And I'll try to highlight that whenever it occurs. It also, in the latter portion, 13 chapters are devoted to cultic activity, priesthood, tabernacle, and all of the things necessary and involved in that priestly reality that God has called them to as a covenant people. And so we'll see that in 13 chapters of the 40. Another question that we need to ask is, why was it written? And I've actually pretty much answered it. Why was Exodus written? Well, when we consider who it was written to, which will be the next question, we know that it was written to show future generations of Israelites what they had been delivered from and how they need to respond to that reality. Right? Because they would not witness the same events as the generation that left Egypt. Okay? And so it was pointedly written to preserve the history, to show future generations where they came from, how God single-handedly delivered them from the most powerful nation, how he gave them the covenant and the law so that they could have this intimate covenantal relationship with himself. So the audience, who is the audience? I've gave the answer already. We know that it wasn't written to us, right? That should be really obvious, especially in relation to a book that's dated to antiquity like this one. But it was written to the Israelites. But what specific audience was it most likely applicable to? Well, I believe, as we'll see, because of when it was written, or when it started to be written, from Sinai forward, it was to govern, at least the law part, it was to govern the generation that left Egypt. Now we'll see that when we get to Numbers, how they failed miserably to let Egypt leave them, and God brings judgment and says they won't enter the land of Canaan. And so it was most likely for the generation that left, and especially the generation that survived the 40 years in the wilderness and would be the generation that would inherit the promised land and establish the kingdom in what would be known as Israel, or the land of Canaan. And so that would be the audience. And so, with that in mind, we have to kind of step into their world the best we can. That's the good thing about Exodus. It forces you to step into their world. Especially when we get into the law and we start looking at the intimate details of the priestly garments and the construction of the tabernacle, the furnishing of the tabernacle. All of these things carry significant theological meaning, and they carry a type and a shadow of things that will be fulfilled in Christ and in the new covenant, even through us. We're actually a fulfillment of some of these types and shadows, right? Because you have the tabernacle, which becomes the temple, and in the New Testament, who's the temple? We are. And so there are a lot of neat things that will be able to cross-reference the New Testament, so it may take us well beyond a year to go through it, because of the uniqueness of Exodus, we can go and we can see the fulfillment of a lot of the things that we hurriedly read through most of the time, right? The priestly garments, I don't care, I don't have to wear it. But there's a lot of significance there, and we'll try to unpack a lot of that and see how relative it is to the New Testament reality. Okay? Who is the author? You could ask that question in different places and get different answers. This is something that is very, very disputed, especially over the last 100+ years. Historically, if we go back to the history of the people that it was given to, they will pointedly tell you and show you and give you proof and evidence that Moses wrote the Torah. You can't think of Exodus by itself when you speak of authorship. Because Moses historically has been said and believed by the very people it was given to have written the first 5 books in the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that has been challenged in recent years, in part because of the flawed view of inspiration. Because it is so commonly taught in the church world that because the Bible is inspired, that means God zapped them into a trance-like state. You know, like the Holy Spirit grabbed their arm and started writing on the papyrus or whatever they were writing on, and that's how we got the Bible. But that's not true at all when you actually look at the text. And so, because when you look at the text, there are some issues that are raised in light of that interpretation of inspiration, it can't be. That can't be a legitimate way to look at the inspiration of the Bible. It just can't. The text denies that. So that has caused people to extrapolate to theories, right? And so you have like the documentary hypothesis. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a terrible hypothesis. I see how they arrived at that conclusion, and they do make some good points in the study of the documentary hypothesis, but I don't buy it. So what is the documentary hypothesis? Anybody remember? We watched a documentary on it, right, that explained it. You can actually, well, we actually watched two. We watched Heiser talk about it some in How We Got the Old Testament, and we also watched the Moses controversy, which brought it up. Okay, so the documentary hypothesis is called the JDEP hypothesis, or sometimes the JEP hypothesis. What does that mean? That's an acronym that means the J stands for Jehovah, because that's how you say in English Yahweh, which is the name of God. And the tradition or the hypothesis goes that there is a certain group of Israelites, and they'll date it way later than Moses, wrote the portions of the Torah where the name Yahweh is used only, right? And we've seen portions in Genesis where like you have a whole chapter where Yahweh is used as the name for God, and then whole chapters where Elohim is the name used for God. So there's a little bit of legitimacy to some of the things the questions they raise, but the conclusions they come to are faulty and deny what the text itself says about itself, as we'll see here in just a minute. So the JDEP, the J stands for Jehovah or Yahwehist. What does the D stand for? Deuteronomist, which believes that you have a single hand in Deuteronomy, and some of those even liberal scholars will say, yeah, Moses wrote a lot of Deuteronomy. Well, partially because they have to accept that because Deuteronomy itself says that. So you kind of are forced into that position. Then you have the E, which stands for Elohim, the portions that they believe are written by an Elohimist, they call. And then you have the P that stands for the priestly tradition. And this is the most rejectable of them all because they believe that the priestly portions, right, the law portions, were written post-exilic. In case you don't know when that is 400 years before Christ, 1,000 years after the history, like in the book of Exodus. And so that is just an unwarranted conclusion that cannot be proven at all. So what is probably the safest position to be? Because again, there are some issues. There are some things that are in the Torah that Moses could not have written. He couldn't have. It's utterly impossible. And I'll show you some examples here in just a second. So we need to investigate because there are, unless you're a person that likes denial, there is textual evidence that is indisputable that prove that there are certain portions of the first 5 books of the Bible that Moses could not have written. It's just completely impossible. So let's look at those. I've created some notes, and this is something awesome about Logos. You can create notes. You can see them right here, and you can see I've created lots of notes throughout time here in this column. But we're going to look at textual evidence for Mosaic authorship of the Torah. And let me say this before we jump into this. I believe in an overwhelming majority authorship by Moses. He wrote almost all of what we have in the first 5 books of the Bible. But there are some places that have been edited, updated, revised, and there are even large portions that were written that he would not have written or could not have written. Okay? So Moses wrote the overwhelming majority of it, but it was edited, revised, place names were updated, and made more relevant to the audience that was reading the text at that time throughout history. There's no way to know when these updates and editing took place for most part, but they did occur. That's not debatable. So textual evidence for Mosaic authorship of the Torah. And this is what I like about creating notes and logos. Everything you type in is hyperlinked. And I can just scroll over it. But for reading's sake, because that window is not that big, I'm going to click on it. And when I click on it, it'll come up here. In Exodus 24, watch what it says. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and rose up early in the morning and built an altar under the hill and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So here we have in Exodus an example where it shows Moses writing down the words of the Lord that were given to him. Okay? Another example is in chapter 34 and verse 27. And the Lord said unto Moses, write these words, for after the tenor of these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. And he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water. And he wrote upon the tables of the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. So we have here another example where the Lord is telling him to write down the law and on the second set of tablets that were given. Another example is in Deuteronomy 31. And Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and unto all the elders of Israel. So here it pointedly says, Moses wrote the law, and he gave it to the priest, the sons of Levi. That's pretty good evidence. On down in verse 21, it says, it shall come to pass when many evils and troubles are befallen them that this song shall testify against them as a witness, for it shall not be forgotten out of the mouths of their seed. For I know their imagination which they go about even now, before I have brought them into the land which I swear. Moses therefore wrote this song the same day and taught it the children of Israel. And he gave Joshua the son of Nun a charge and said, be strong of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land. This is right before he passes away and Joshua takes over as the leader. And that song is recorded, if you just keep scrolling, in chapter 32 that Moses wrote. So again, more evidence. Joshua 1 and verse 7. It says, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses, my servant, commanded you. So this is Joshua receiving orders to cling to the law that Moses received and was preserved by Moses and given to the priest. Okay? We got quite a bit of evidence piling up here. 2 Chronicles 25 verse 4 says, but he slew not their children, but did as it is written in the law, in the book of Moses. This is later on in Israelite history. And the Israelites themselves say, in what we call the inspired word of God, it is written in the law, in the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, saying, the father shall not die for the children, neither shall the children die for the fathers, but every man shall die for his own sin. So the Israelites, the Hebrew people themselves, say and believe that Moses wrote it. I mean, that's pretty good point for Mosaic authorship if the people that was given this piece of writing say that he wrote it, right? And it's in the scripture elsewhere. Nehemiah 13 verse 1. On that day they read in the book of Moses, in the book of Moses, in the audience of the people. Okay? So that's not all of them. We could do that for quite a while and see specific verses that mention the authorship of Moses and his involvement in writing what is called the law. And the law is the first 5 books of the Bible. Nobody questions that Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay? Let's look at even weightier evidence, shall we, in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 8. Jesus said unto him, see, you tell no man, but go your way and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. Okay, we had a lot of good evidence. Good evidence just became irrefutable evidence. If Jesus himself gives authorship to the law to Moses, I'm going with Jesus. I don't care what kind of name whatever liberal scholar has. This is what Jesus said. Okay, so I'm going with him. Matthew chapter 19 verse 7. They say unto him, this is the Jews talking to Jesus, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? So the Jews, even in the first century, believed that Moses wrote the Torah, as we just read. Look at 22. The Sadducees. This is the priesthood. The Sadducees are the priesthood in Jesus' day. They came to him saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. So again, the priestly class of Hebrew people in Jesus' day affirm Mosaic authorship. Let's look some more. Mark chapter 7. What did you do that for? Mark chapter 7. This is in red letters, which is good. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother. And then he elaborates even more. So he said, Moses said that. Let's look at Mark 12 and verse 26. This is in red letters again. And as touching the dead, that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses how in the bush God spake to him? So without a doubt, Jesus believes that Moses wrote the book of Exodus, because that's what that's a reference to. Right? See what Luke says. Luke 2 verse 22. And when the days of her purification according to the law of Moses were accomplished, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. So they ascribe the purification laws after the birth of Christ as being ascribed to who? The law of Moses. Let's look at chapter 24, verse 27. This is Jesus on the Emmaus Road. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Again, pointing to the Torah. John chapter 1. John, he was kind of in the inner circle, right? For the law was given by Moses. That's pretty clear. The law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Which is why we have moved from being under the Mosaic law to being under what? The law of Christ. Why? Because we've been freed from two. Freed from being slaves of sin, slaves to the world, to being slaves or servants of Christ. Right? Let's look down in verse 45. Philip finds Nathanael and said unto him, We have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Let's look in chapter 7. Jesus is saying this. Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keep the law? You can skip down and look. He keeps saying it. Moses gave you circumcision, not because it's of Moses, but of the fathers. And you on the Sabbath day circumcise a man, if a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken. Are you angry at me because I have made a man whole on the Sabbath day? Judge not according to appearance, we read this Sunday, but judge righteous judgment. So again, Jesus, several places, has given authorship to who? Moses. Let's look at the last example. 8 and verse 5. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. This is the woman caught in the act, right? And this is the Jewish establishment, religious leaders who are saying this. So everybody believes that Moses wrote it except the liberal scholars 3,400 years removed and later who think they know better than the people it was given to in Jesus. Documentary hypothesis. Now let's look at some of the legitimacy of some of the points they raise because they are legit, but they're easy to explain. So, textual evidence for revisions and additions to what Moses wrote. The whole chapter of Deuteronomy 34. When you read that chapter, it talks about the death and the burial of Moses. How many of you know that you can't write after you're dead? Now, people will say, oh, he knew before what was going to happen and he wrote about it in great detail. No, that's not true. That was added, most likely by Joshua. Okay? Here's another example. Genesis chapter 11. And Terah took Abram his son and Lot the son of Haran his son's son and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldeans. That word did not exist, and those people did not exist even at the time of Moses. He could not have written that. Those are a people group that developed long after Moses was alive. It is impossible for him to have written that. And so this would have been post-exilic updated. Because, and the reason why they would have updated it and why they updated this specific place is because where were the Israelites, or where was Judah, where were they exiled to? That area. The Babylonians, the Chaldeans. That was another name for them. But that wasn't a name for them back in Abraham's time or in Moses' time. Okay? That was centuries later. And so Moses could not have written that. It would have been updated to the name of the location or the reference to the Chaldeans to the post-exilic times. Okay? Genesis 14 and 14. And I remember this specific verse. It always stood out to me before I ever even got into like scholarship or competent studying in the Bible. I remember I had just started studying the Bible for myself, had made a vow to God, I'm going to have an open mind and you teach me. And I remember reading this verse because I started in Genesis, right? I'm going to understand the Bible. You start in Genesis and you're still there a year later, right? And I remember reading this verse. It says, when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Well, I've been raised in church, and I am real familiar with what is written in the Bible, even at that point. And I remember that the Israelites didn't come into the land of Canaan while Moses was alive. So the tribe of Dan didn't have a tribal allotment, and they didn't have the city of Dan. The city of Dan, it comes into existence in the period of the Judges. That's well after Moses, and that's hundreds of years after Abraham. And I remember going, why did he write that? You know, because I'm in this ideology mode. You know, Moses was zapped and he wrote the Torah. And I remember thinking, but that's impossible. Dan didn't exist when he wrote the Torah. It's just impossible. And I remember sitting there at my desk thinking, what do I do with this? There's no way he wrote that. But I've been told, but there's no way. No, you can't deny the facts. You can't deny the hard evidence. It could not be. Because Dan wasn't there. It didn't exist. The city didn't exist. And since then, I've been to Israel and actually been to the city of Dan. But I remember that so clearly. And then later on in studies, you have those aha moments. That's why. Because maybe what I was told wasn't true. Right? And here's how to think better about what the evidence itself actually presents. And that's my goal in all that we're doing here, is that we examine evidence, right? And sometimes we're not going to have all the evidence, and we're going to arrive at a conclusion that can be better informed later on. And that's where we got to be humble and correct ourselves and say, you know, I was doing the best I could with the evidence that I knew, but now I have better evidence, so I'm better informed. I'm going to make a better judgment on what we need to understand here, and that's exactly this case. Let's look at Genesis 36, verse 31. And these are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. That's in Genesis, right? I remember reading this too, and I was like, if Moses wrote this, Israel had never had a king. Israel wasn't even in Israel. It was still called Canaan. How could he have wrote this? Do you see this? There is no way he could have written that. Before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. For you to write that statement is to have the knowledge that kings have reigned over Israel. None had before Moses, and didn't for centuries, even when they got to the land of Canaan and made it what we know as the land of Israel. He could not have written that. There is no way. He could not have wrote it. Are you seeing this? These are some of the issues that cause them to, make up these other theories. Numbers 12 and verse 3. Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. Do you think a meek, humble person would write that about themselves? And why is it in parentheses? That was likely added later on, because they had such a high view of Moses, because he led them out of Egypt and gave them the Mosaic Law. And you'll see here, I have a note here, and we could go to several examples. There are several instances where it says in the Torah, on this side of the Jordan River, as if they're in the land of Israel already. He would not have written that way because he never, ever lived in the land of Israel. Ever. He was in Egypt 40 years. He was in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. And he was in the Sinai Peninsula 40 more years. Right? So, and then in the Transjordan area, there at the end, the plains of Moab. So there's no way he could have written it from the perspective of being inside the land of Israel. So it was updated and revised at some point later on. We don't know when, but it had to have been, because he could not have spoken that way of being in the land when he never was in the land. Okay? Those are just some of the examples. There are more in both categories, but those are some of the examples. So, again, this is my position, and I believe this is the position that the evidence demands. Moses wrote, you could say nearly all of it, with amendments, additions, editing, updates, things of that nature. Okay? The date of the book of Exodus. When there's two questions to ask in relation to the date. What is the date of the composition? And I'm going to agree with the conclusion that we see in Patterns of Evidence. I'm going to go with an early date. I want to go with the composition taking place between 1446 and 1406. For the most part, while Moses was leading the Israelites from Sinai, chapter 19 of Exodus, onward, during that 40-year tenure in the wilderness, Moses would have written. He likely wrote most of it while at Sinai, but added things here and there throughout the wilderness journey. Okay? The events. When did the actual events that we see in Exodus take place? For the most part, the events in Exodus span a period of 81 years. Pretty much beginning with this king that arises, that oppresses Israel, creates this rule of genocide. Moses is saved, right? We'll get into the story. He lives in Pharaoh's house 40 years. Then he leads the children of Israel for 40 years. So about 81 years of events from the birth of Moses till the end. So to give you an actual BC date, 1526 to 1445. Because the events, let me back up. I think I said that wrong. The events are from Moses' birth till a year after the Exodus itself. Because they're at Sinai 10 months, right? There's months traveling, or there's a period of travel, and then they arrive at Sinai and they spend 10 months there, as we'll see. So, most of that is 80 years of the Israelites being enslaved. Okay? Make sense? How can we date that? Why can we date that? Everybody know what math is? All right. Let's look at 1 Kings. This is how we get the date of the Exodus. 1 Kings 6 says, "It came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Zeph, which is the second month that he began to build the house of the Lord. Okay, so it says 480 years from the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel is when the Exodus took place. Because of archaeological evidence and other historical evidence, you can pretty concretely date Solomon's reign beginning in 970 BC. So you take off 4 years, takes you down to 966, right? Then you add 480 years of that, and that's what brings you to what is called the early date of the Exodus, 1446 BC. Okay? What is some background knowledge that is needed to understand the book of Exodus? This is kind of unique. It's the second book. That gives us a lot of options, don't it? Genesis. It is so important to understand the book of Genesis if you're going to understand the book of Exodus. Right? Y'all want a quick rundown of the book of Genesis right quick? It's probably one of my favorite books in the Bible, so it's easy for me to talk about. Genesis 1 and 2 is the creation story. Genesis 3 is the fall. Genesis 4 is the story of Cain and Abel. At the end of that, it tells us about the replacement of Abel with another son named Seth, which leads us to a genealogy in chapter 5 that is 10 generations from Adam to Seth all the way down to who? Noah. That's chapter 5, the genealogy. In chapter 6, it gives us a brief telling. Well, there's these divine beings, these sons of God, they intermingled with human beings, created these giants. The whole earth became corrupted. Everything was corrupted. God said, 120 years, you don't get it straightened out and repent, I'm going to destroy the earth. Well, nobody believes. So from chapter 6 through chapter 9, you have the story of Noah and his wife and the 3 sons and their wives building this ark, getting on this ark. Nobody gets on, the animals get on, and everybody else dies in the flood. Which brings us to chapter 10, which is called the Table of the Nations. The Table of Nations is basically showing us where Noah and his sons dispersed after they got off the ark and started the creation mandate again, which is what? To be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, spread out all over the earth. And so they do that. And you have the maps, that show what's called the Table of the Nations, where they all dispersed and developed. But it's out of chronological order because that happened in response to what we read in chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel, where everybody was in one place in Mesopotamia. They build this tower. God comes down, confounds their language, and they disperse into what we see described in Genesis chapter 10. Well, what happens immediately after chapter 11 and after this dispersal? Because of the judgment of Babel, God turns over the nations to the lesser Elohim, but what does he do in chapter 12? He chooses a man named Abram, calls him out of Mesopotamia. Where does he call him to? Canaan. Imagine that. This is one of those cycles that we see repeated later on. Okay, so what is the rest of Genesis about? From Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis chapter 25, it's all about Abraham. Abraham, the promise, all of the mess in between, the ultimate comes to pass, the promise comes to pass, Isaac is born. You have about half a chapter on Isaac, that's all he's getting, right? It talks about his betrothal that's organized by the steward of Abraham. And then what happens? It moves directly into the story of what? Jacob and Esau, which is a story of 2 nations, right? 2 people groups. Well, that story. Jacob ends up going off to his ancestors of his family. He gets 2 wives, works a whole lot longer than he wanted to, turns into a big deal, have a family falling out, runs him down. He returns. Then he has a family, and he has 12 sons. Well, one of them's his favorite. That gets him into trouble. They sell him into slavery in Egypt. and the famine hits. You know the story of Joseph. Everybody who is a Hebrew, an Israelite, those that are descendants of Jacob, end up in Egypt, right? And that's how the story ends in Genesis, with all of Jacob's kids and Jacob himself living in Egypt while Joseph is ruling and reigning, and it tells us about their deaths. End of story. Genesis is over. And then Exodus picks up right where it left off, saying, after some time, there arose a king that did not know Joseph, who didn't care what Joseph had done for Egypt, only seeing that Israel is blessed. They're multiplying. They are becoming numerous, and they're becoming a threat to their national identity and their power. And so they put forth a plan to make sure they don't overthrow and take over the kingdom. And that's what Exodus will be all about. God delivering them from that enslavement to be the people of God. And we're going to develop the themes that run through the book of Exodus, which are going to be many and lots of fun. So, 5 minutes to spare. Any questions?
No. Go ahead. Does this 1 Kings 6, it's given a time frame here. We just watched the documentary the other day. That why is there confusion if it gives a date?
There is confusion because of the dating system of after Adam and the genealogies that bring us to the birth of Abraham, because you can actually use the genealogies, and if the genealogies are giving us literal time frames that those people lived, that puts the birth of Abraham at 1948. When you start doing the math and you start adding 99 years till Isaac's born, then you add the difference until Jacob's born, and then you add till Joseph's born, you have a problem. You have a problem. There's not enough time in between there if the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years, like Genesis says. And so the question is raised, well, when do they start counting time? And it's a mess. It is a mess. There's a timeline in Logos, and it shows all kinds of information about the timing of events, or the plausible times. You can see here it says Joseph buries Jacob. That's the late date. And so I even have a problem in my model, because I accept a late date for the birth of Abraham, but I accept an early Exodus. Whereas they expect that if you accept an early date or a late date for the birth of Abraham, that forces you to take a late date for the Exodus. But there's so much evidence for the late date of the patriarchs and an early date for the Exodus that I'm not sure. My theory is there's a problem in all of it. Trust me. My theory is the 400 years can't be dated as they've traditionally dated it from the time of Joseph until they're actually liberated in the Exodus. Because it can't be. The math just does not work out. And so, again, there are huge problems. The other option is, okay, the ages that are given in the genealogies are not literal. Or the Masoretic text is not right and the Septuagint is, because the Septuagint, as we've seen in Genesis, differs dramatically in the ages that we see, like in Genesis chapter 5. The lifespans and how long they lived before they had children. And trust me, I got intrigued with this years ago. I wanted to solve the puzzle, I wanted to figure it out, and the more I studied, the more frustrated I got, and the more I had to dig. And the more I came to the conclusion, I just can't solve this. And I haven't found anyone that can either. I think there's some ambiguity in the 400 years and what that means. Perhaps that's a symbolic number that's given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 when he makes the covenant with Abraham while he's asleep. That's the only explanation that makes sense to me, that it represents 4 generations somehow. Not to say that 100 years is descriptive of a generation throughout the Bible, because there's different time periods, 40 years, 100 years, that could represent a generation. So, but as far as dating the actual Exodus, we can safely date that to 1446 based on this. But then it throws off your patriarchal birth dates and stuff. So it's complicated. I could explain it in detail, but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be interested. Shane?
So we know from Genesis that there are portions of that book that are written to refute the other stories and histories of people groups around that area.
Yeah, there's polemic undertones for sure.
Right. So like the flood story and things of that nature. So with Exodus, there were talks in the documentary that we watched, The Patterns of Evidence, of like the plagues. The plagues are part of Egyptian history, and there are different theories as to why that happened and who was responsible for it. Are there other areas of Exodus that are pointedly to refute other gods and their responsibility and things that happen within this book?
Do you mean in particular like specific plagues being specific judgments on specific gods they worshipped in Egypt?
Yeah, like they're trying to usurp other stories of other peoples to say, no, the God of the Bible is responsible for this. Because like, I know the plagues would be one, and to refute the Egyptian story, but are there other, I know the law would probably be void of that, other than to say we're to set ourselves apart from the other people groups. But the first portion of that, like the splitting of the Red Sea, is there any other stories out there that would be?
I think after the plagues, you see the deliverance of Israel, and then you move into the crossing of the Red Sea. I think from that point forward, from the deliverance, the Passover lamb, which is obviously a symbol or type of Christ, from there forward, you move from polemic against Egypt to types, shadows, and symbolism for the covenant people of God, whether that be the Israelites or ultimately the church. And we'll unpack those symbols and typology as we get to them. But I don't think it's so much polemical from that point forward, say Exodus 15 forward.
Isn't there something with the baby in the river, and there's some similar stories?
Yes, there are actually a lot of stories in antiquity where you have a child who is placed in certain death, and somehow they're miraculously delivered and they become this great person. Yes, there are a lot of stories like that, and that causes people to say, well, every culture has stories like that, so what makes Moses unique or different? Because after all, we can't prove the Exodus ever happened, and they get into all the conjecture and the theories and hypotheses. So yes, there are stories that are similar in concept. My thought is, doesn't the enemy mimic everything God would do? So go ahead.
So I was listening to a podcast with Michael Heiser, and he was talking about how David Roll's theory from Patterns of Evidence has some great points, and he wishes that people would explore those a little more. But the big flaw in his timeline is that he moves that whole timeline back because he's trying to prove that Ramses is Shishak, and that was a stretch because of some other writing somewhere else that references a nickname for Ramses that's very close sounding to Shishak. So that basically what he's saying is, because that's such he debunks himself and a lot of his good points on the dating.
Yeah, his biggest issue is kind of what I brought up in here, is if you move back the Exodus to an early date, naturally you would assume you have to move the patriarchal dates back too, as well as other histories, you know? And so that's the problems you get into. And you have to admit there are some problems there if you are to take the genealogies literal and the 400 years literal. And depending on where you place that 400 years, when you start it and build up towards the Exodus being the end of it. So there are definitely problems with the chronology, for sure. But then people say, well, if there's a problem, then the Bible can't be inspired. Then who can believe any of it? That's what they say. And I understand why they would say that. Because you have a problem. You can't be the goofy Christian who says, no, there's not a problem. Because math is math. You know, you can't deny the evidence. You just have to be humble enough to say, man, I can't explain it. I don't have all the answers. But these are the possible explanations. And my well thought out answer is the 400 years is symbolic. It's easy to say, but I can't prove it, right? It solves the problem, but then the objector would say, well, you're cheating because you're taking that one number symbolically. Why not all of them? Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Good point. That's kind of like the people who want to take like part of Revelation symbolically and part of it literally.
Yeah.
That's cheating. So, yeah, there are issues with the dating, no doubt. I need to do the math again sometime on the Samaritan Pentateuch, and which is the Samaritan version of the Torah, and the genealogy dates, and the Septuagint. And kind of crunch some numbers and see if. But then you're doing that wanting to make it fit again, so you know they can point that out. So any way you go, there's issues, no doubt. It's not as neat as everybody thinks. It's not as neat as you were told in Sunday school. Let's say that. Any other questions? So are you guys wanting to have an Exodus at this point?
Early years.
All right.